Walking with a Limp is a series that we've been in now for several weeks, journeying with a man by the name of Jacob. And today we're going to come to the climax of his story. We're going to come to the moment in which his life is forever transformed and changed for the better. And it has so much to help us to understand and how those moments happen and what's on the other side of them. And so today we've entitled this, When Losing is Winning, which I think is something all Denver Bronco fans need to keep in mind this afternoon when God's favorite team, the Dallas Cowboys, destroys you later this afternoon. Please don't text me if it goes the other way, okay? So let's jump into this. Sometimes, people along the way have asked me this question. Maybe you've asked this question or it's been asked of you. Do you really believe the Bible is true, right? There's all kinds of stories in there. Do you believe that it is true? And I believe it is true. And sometimes people say, well, why do you believe it's true? And there are a lot of reasons. One of the reasons that I believe it's true is because of stories like Jacob's. Stories like the one that we've been journeying with now for a number of weeks, because unlike so many other places in the world where there are fables and accounts of heroes that are sort of manufactured to highlight certain values and strengths and become like that person, emulate this, what you find in the Bible is people who are just so broken. And every time you want to go there to find, be a hero, be like them. Ooh, what about that part of their life? And Jacob has shown us that over and over again. And how is it that imperfect people like us can be in the presence of a holy God? How does that happen? And today, as we come to this defining moment in Jacob's life, we're going to see that he's going to discover, here is the meaning of my life. Here is the purpose of my life. The real problem that I thought was in my life was not the real problem at all. And on the other side of this, he will be forever a changed man. And maybe when our lives, are playing out, we would like our life to be like the line on the bottom, right? That we get from point A to point B, and it's pretty much a straight line in one direction. But if you've been with us, you know that Jacob's life and probably your life and my life look more like the line on the top. And there's all these twists and turns. And now as we get to the end of Jacob's jumbled up mess of self and brokenness, he's going to meet God in a unique way. And you know what he's going to discover about God? God's a wrestler. And he is wrestling Jacob, and he's willing to wrestle people like us for a really, really good reason. Have you ever wrestled with God? My guess, if you've logged any time, you probably have. We often wrestle God with our questions, our why questions. God, why didn't you answer that prayer? Seemed like a good thing. Why wouldn't you answer that prayer? We wrestle God with our where questions. Where were you when I needed you? It felt like I was all alone, and then we wrestle God with our how questions. God, how do I trust you when nothing makes sense? And it can feel like, we just don't get clarity and we don't get peace, and it just seems like this ongoing wrestling match. Here's what Jacob is going to show us. God often answers on the other side of the struggle. And that God's purpose is made clear when we continue to engage and to wrestle and struggle even with God, to pursue what he has for us. So before we jump into the climactic moment of his life, I want to give us a running start here and talk about the bigger picture here so we understand how this story has unfolded to this point. The world is broken, and so what does God do? God comes to a man named Abraham, this is Jacob's grandfather, and says, I'm going to go to work to redeem and to restore, to fix what is broken with this world. How is he going to do that? He's going to create a nation. And he's going to start with Abraham and his wife Sarah. What is so remarkable about them? And the answer is nothing. God is just going to do it. And that's where he starts. And he makes this promise that you will become a great nation, and I will bless all the nations of the earth through you, because ultimately one day would come one who was a Messiah, a Redeemer, a Restorer. And so in each generation, there would be a child of promise. And Abraham goes on to have a child named Isaac. And Isaac is a child of promise. And then Isaac and Rebekah have fraternal twins, Esau and Jacob. Esau is the oldest by minutes. But in those days, the firstborn, that meant a lot. But God shows up in that and makes this promise, this prediction. The older will serve the younger. God takes the cultural norms, turns it upside down, and says the younger, Jacob, is actually going to be the one through whom I'm going to continue my work and my purpose toward ultimately sending a Messiah. And so naturally we would think, well, the one through whom God is going to work, all is going to be good and right. But Jacob, his name means deceiver. It means usurper, or one who lies and cheats. And we begin to see that unfold in his life. In a moment of weakness, he takes advantage of his brother's appetite, and he has something called a birthright, which gave him authority and wealth and all those kind of things. I'll trade you that for a bowl of porridge, and his brother makes a foolish, foolish trade. But then years later, his father is near death. He's blind, and he wants to bless his son. And his father, Isaac, even in direct contradiction to what God has revealed, says, I prefer the older, and I want to give my blessing to the older son, to Esau, and so go out and get some game. Well, in the meantime, Jacob dresses up like his brother, comes in, and his blind father asks him this question, is it you, Esau? Is it my firstborn, so I can bless you? And Jacob says, yes, it's me, Esau. He's pretending to be somebody that he is not. And he gets the blessing through deception, through manipulation, through lying, through cheating. And when his brother finds out, man, he's not good without, and he threatens and swears up and down, when dad is dead, I am going to kill my brother Jacob. And so what does Jacob do? He runs for the hills. And he runs about 500 miles away, and he goes to work for an uncle of his whose name is Laban, and he gets married once, and he gets married again, and that's a whole story, and if you're part of that, back up a couple weeks online, you can see all of that. And he has a bunch of kids, and he goes to work for his uncle, and God blesses him, but he also, through some different ways of manipulation, takes advantage of his uncle, and now his uncle is not happy with him, and he's upset, and then God comes to Jacob and says, you know what, Jacob? It's time to go home. So he begins to head home. But who's waiting for him there? Esau, who swore that he was going to kill him. And so as we're going to pick up the story, he's on his way home, and then he gets word that Esau's on his way toward him, and they're going to meet somewhere in the middle. Oh, and by the way, Jacob, he's got 400 men with him. He's got like a small army with him. Awesome. This is going to go really, really well. And so you know what Jacob does? He's still Jacob doing Jacob things. He's got all this wealth because God blessed him, and wealth back then was not in paper money and coins, it was in herds. So he's got all these herds, and then he's got all this family, and he does this. So Esau's coming at him. He takes his herds and puts them over on one side there, and then he takes his family and puts them over on the other side, and then he's standing in back behind all of that on the other side of a river. Why is he doing that? Well, if Esau attacks the herds, my family escapes. If he attacks my family, the herds escape. I still have my wealth. But most of all, Jacob escapes. And he is behind the scenes. And in that moment is where we pick up the story. Genesis 32:22. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons, and crossed the ford of the Jabbok, that river. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions. So Jacob was left alone. And many times when we encounter God in a life-changing sort of way, it is in moments when we are alone, but sometimes those alone moments can even happen in a room full of people, but all of a sudden it feels like it's just me and God, and in those moments, powerful and profound things can be understood about the nature of a relationship with God. Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him till daybreak. So he's on his way to meet his brother Esau. All of a sudden he turns around and there's somebody else there. Who is this mysterious man who shows up? And commentators are divided. Some believe this was an angel sent by God to carry out and deliver his message and to carry out part of his purpose. Other commentators believe this is a pre-incarnate appearance of none other than Jesus. Jesus is the eternal Son of God. And in this moment, he shows up at one of the crucial moments in divine history to accomplish God's purpose. But either way, This is wrestling with God. And he wrestles all night. And Jacob is now in the fight for his life. And you can only wrestle all night if it's pretty much an even match, right? And here is Jacob thinking, I'm about this next day to have an encounter with the guy who has been the biggest problem in my life for decades. 21 years ago is when he ran away from home. But tomorrow I'm going to meet Esau. He has been the problem in my life for so long. And he turns around and he has a wrestling match with someone else. And in this moment, Jacob comes to realize Esau was never the real problem. That my problem, my wrestling, my struggle has always been against God. And when the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. And the word for touch there is the most soft, gentle word that you can use. So this is not punched his hip and took it out of joint. This is not grabbed it and wrenched it. This is just a finger tap. And when you understand that, I think we begin to understand that this wrestling match that kind of fought to a draw over the course of this night was not because of this strange man who shows up, was using all his abilities, and Jacob was using all his abilities, and it was pretty much an even draw. The strange visitor is voluntarily restraining so much of his power. Because just a touch knocks his hip out of socket, and for the rest of his days, Jacob is going to walk with a limp. And in this moment, perhaps for the first time, Jacob comes to realize, you know what? You are not as strong as you think you are. That there is someone so much stronger than you. And this wrestling match that has been fought all night long is not because you had all the ability to make that happen. It's because that one was letting you maybe come to the end of yourself and use up all of your energy and all of your strength and all of your ability and see, even at the end of that, it's not enough. Every dad in the room, my guess is you've done this. I have one son, and if you have a son, my guess is along the way, especially when your kids were little, you know what you did? You wrestled them. Right? And so they come and they want to take on dad. And what do? Do you use all your power and all your weight and everything at your disposal? No, for the most part, you're just letting them, kind of go at it. And probably even sometimes you lay it on your back and let them jump off the couch, kind of like they're coming off the third rope there in a WWE kind of thing. And you could have easily ended that in just a moment, but you didn't. Because it was about something bigger than that. And in this moment, when Jacob finally uses up all his energy, all his strength, he's fighting and fighting and fighting. And then he gets touched. And he is forever wounded. This becomes a defining moment of his life. He is a different person on the other side of this moment than he is before this moment. And all of a sudden he realizes that the real issue, the real problem of his life was not Esau all along. I've been wrestling with God. God made these promises to me about what he was going to do, the purpose and the plan. But boy, I sure felt like I had to help him out and I had to use my resources. So I manipulated and I cheated and I deceived and did all of that because after all, God, didn't he make a promise? But he's not trusting God's grace to fulfill his purposes in his way. Not to this point in his life. But finally, he's in the struggle for his life. And when his hip gets touched, he realizes that he's not as strong as he thought he was. And notice what happens on the other side of this. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." What does Jacob's name mean? Literally, it's heel grabber. It's an idiom that means deceiver or one that supplants someone else. Somebody's grabbing and trying to get ahead with their own abilities, with their own ways of manipulation. And he's been doing that his whole life in all kinds of different ways. But notice what happens here in this moment. Instead of being somebody who's wrestling with God and trying to even use God to accomplish even God's purposes in his own way, now all of a sudden he's given up and he is holding on to this one and saying, I will not let you go. He's going from wrestling with God to wrestling for God and saying, I will not let you go until the blessing comes. And this is a blessing that I can't steal like I did 21 years ago. It's not the blessing that I can deceive my blind father into giving me. This is the blessing that only you can give. This is the moment of transformation in Jacob's life, and now he is holding on to God and just allowing whatever happens on the other side of that to be God's doing. And the man asked him, what's your name? Jacob, he answered. Remember what he said 21 years ago? His blind dad asked him the question, is it you, Esau, my firstborn? And Jacob says, oh yeah, it's me. It's Esau, said Jacob. But on this day, just call me Jacob. And maybe for the first time in his life, Jacob is willing to acknowledge who he is and to be who he really is. And to stop pretending and to stop manipulating and stop trying to manage the outcomes and help God along with his promises in whatever way he deems are appropriate or right. And then look what happens on the other side of that. The man said, your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel. He changes his name. He changes his identity. Because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome. And so even in this, God shows up in this moment and there is just the grace of God that comes to him that you've been wrestling, but you have overcome because of the grace of God. And Jacob said, please tell me your name. But he replied, why do you ask my name? And then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, it is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared. The sun rose over him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Forever limping. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. So what does this story have to tell us about the dynamic between God and us and a holy God and broken people like us? You know, maybe the headline of it would read something like this: when we would surrender to God, we win by losing. When we finally come to the end of ourselves and we stop striving and we stop trying to use God to accomplish the purposes that we think he should accomplish in the way that we think he should accomplish them, when we stop manipulating, we stop pretending about who we are, and we finally just give up and say, God, I'm just now going to hold on to you. And I'm going to look to you to bless me. And I'm just going to leave that to you. But I'm not going to make it happen. And I'm going to stop doing what I have been doing for so long, pretending to be somebody else, trying to manufacture the outcomes that only truly you control. To this point, he has not depended on God's grace. He has been using God for his own purposes. But on this day, he surrenders. And he really kind of loses, discovering, hey, I just got my hip touched. And it could have been a whole lot more. He could have come in all his power and wiped out evil, but you know what? He would have lost Jacob. So he just touches him. What do we gain when we surrender to God? Jacob discovers his destiny. The promise of a people and a land and a nation, of all of that. He has been 500 miles away from that because he has run away from the consequences of his own deceptions. But now finally he will come back home and discover God's purpose and God's promises are exactly what he said they were. But he's going to discover them God's way and not his. And also on the other side of the surrender on this day, I think we can understand this, that when God wounds us, it's to wake us up. And sometimes we wonder, God, why were you not in the middle of that struggle that I had? Could it be that sometimes God allows us to experience the consequences of our own decisions and actions so that we wind up with a little bit of a limp on the other side of that? And it's not to hurt us, but it is to heal us. It is not to fatally wound us, but to wake us up to the reality of where our real struggle lies. And our real struggle is wrestling with God. The limp in Jacob's life every day that he would carry out was a sign of grace, so much less than what he deserved. And yet there was a regular reminder about where his own actions and his own decisions and his own brokenness got him. They're the wounds of grace. And if you've experienced some wounding in your life and saying, God, why am I walking with a limp? Maybe that was God's wake-up call to you. That he wants you to come and have that kind of encounter where you hold on to him and look for his blessing and that alone. When we surrender to God, we win by recognizing that surrender to God changes everything about you. In that moment, God changes his identity. He goes from being Jacob the deceiver to Israel. What does that mean? One who wrestles with God. And there's a real subtle distinction in the language. We can wrestle against God, or we can wrestle in a way of holding on to God and saying, I will not let you go until you bless me. And I wonder if for all of us, that's kind of the choices that we have in front of us. For Jacob on the other side of this day, it's going to be holding on to God. And he's going to do that in a way that he has never done in his life. What name maybe have you carried with you through your life? What name maybe have others brought you or your experience has brought you? Could it be a name like disappointment, unworthy, addict? When we step into that relationship with God, he can give us a new name. And with him, it can be beloved, redeemed, forgiven, purposeful, worth it. Have you had that kind of encounter with God where he begins to change everything about you? So what do we do with all of this? And I want to give you some suggestions here. Things maybe that we can stop and things that we can start, and maybe one of these applies to each of us. What do we do with all of this? Stop running from your struggles and start looking for God in your struggles. I fear that oftentimes when we look at the difficult times in our lives, we think God's a million miles away. Remember Jacob's story. He wasn't even looking for God in this moment. He's thinking about an encounter with Esau that is coming the next day. But God shows up in his struggle. And when you're in the middle, the darkness of the night, and you're facing an enemy that you think is the biggest problem you've ever had in your life, look for God in that space. But how often do we run in the opposite direction? How often do we think we can just manage it and we can just continue on the way that it is? I want to give you an example of that from somebody named Max Lucado, and I don't know if that name means anything to you. He was a very well-known pastor in America. In fact, a few years ago, Christianity Today, a magazine, called him America's pastor. He had written several New York Times bestseller books. That's a really hard thing to do. His church was located in San Antonio, Texas, was huge. And even tourism companies would say one of the things that you should do in and around San Antonio is to go to Max Lucado's church on Sunday. Tour buses would pull in and people would go to church at Max Lucado's church. He was America's pastor and he was so well known. This is what he writes in a book entitled God Never Gives Up on You. What nobody knew was this: I was a mess. On the outside, it looked great, but the reality was something different. Our staff was struggling, but who had time for that? I had more sermons to prepare, books to write, deadlines were coming. He went to the doctor. He had an irregular heartbeat, and he told him, hey, this is stress, and you need to slow down. And you have to slow down in all kinds of different ways. How can I slow down? I have a publisher who is on me about a deadline, a staff that needs me for this and that. I have sermons to prepare. And then he writes this. So what I did came naturally. I began to drink. Not publicly, but I was the guy that you'd see at the convenience store who hides the bottle against his thigh as he walks out the door. My store of choice was on the other side of the city, lest I be seen. I'd sit in the car, pull out that can out of the bag, and guzzle the liquid until it took the edge off. That's how America's pastor was coping. My J-Bach moment, as it turned out, was in a parking lot. The wrestling match lasted for the better part of an hour on a spring afternoon. I told God, I have everything under control. The deadlines, the staff issues, my drinking, it's all manageable. And then came the moment of truth. God didn't touch my hip, but he spoke to my heart. Really, Max? If you have it under control, why are you hiding in this parking lot, sipping beer you hid in a brown paper bag? Have you had your J-Bach moment? And I wonder if that moment for us, maybe it's an issue similar to that. But maybe inside of a marriage, man, you've been struggling. And maybe you're putting on a good appearance, but just managing that and continuing down that road, is it maybe time to deal with the issue and to face the issue and not run away from it and not think that we can manage it? Is it another relational struggle where things are far apart and you know it's not right? Well, you know what? Maybe I'll hope it goes away. Maybe I'll just hope for the best, or maybe I'll just, deal with it and move on. And many times in those moments, we think God is not here. Jacob tells you, oh, yes, he is. And he is right there inviting you not to run away, maybe even to come to the end of yourself, maybe to humble yourself to the point of saying, I give up. And God, now hold on to you and trust you for what's on the other side of it. The next day, Jacob does meet his brother Esau. You know what happens? Esau doesn't wipe him out with his army of 400 men. He comes up, and Jacob is a surrendered man and just basically falls on his knees before his brother. And you know what his brother does? Embraces him. And the outcomes that we try to manage in all kinds of different ways will bring us to the end of ourselves. But maybe it's just time to say, I surrender. I give up. Look for God in your struggles and God's ways through your struggles. What can we do with this? Stop using God and start depending on God. How do we use God? The same way Jacob did. In an earlier message, we looked at a night when Jacob is sleeping and his pillow is a rock, and God brings a stairway down to show him that God is at work in this world. And he makes the promise that he made to his grandfather Abraham, going to make you a people, and you're going to have a land and all of that. And you know what Jacob says on the other side of that? Great. Yeah, if you do all of that, well then, yeah, you will be my God. And he makes it very conditional. And I wonder how many times in our lives we make our dynamic, our dependence on God conditional on what he does for us in the way that we think he should do it. And when we do that, we are using God in one way or another to accomplish our purpose and our plan. But Jacob finally comes to the moment, I'm just going to hold on to you, and I'm going to wait for your blessing. And let you decide what that is. So maybe it's time to stop making our journey together with God conditional. God, if you do this, well, then I will. It's using God. Instead, depend on God. And then one more thing, stop trusting your power and start trusting God's restrained power. What do you mean? Jacob's whole life to this point has been about his resources, his ability, his deceptive ingenuity, which served him all too well. For so long, he got away with it. But then he has this encounter with God where there is voluntary restraint of power. Because if God had come in all of his power, he would have lost Jacob. Now think about this. What was ultimately the promise? That one day God would bring a Messiah into this world. And generations later, here comes Jesus. Jesus is God the Son in the flesh. And did he come in all his power and wipe out evil? No. You know why not? Because he would have lost all of us. And so he came with his power restrained and his power under control. And he did it all so that ultimately he could rescue people like us. And then he voluntarily allowed himself to be nailed to a cross to make payment for our sins. And one day he is coming back, and he'll come back in all his power. And on that day he will deal with evil fully and finally. But the reason for him coming and what the world saw as losing by dying on a cross, capital punishment, turned into God's victory because it allowed people like you and me to be made right with a holy God. And we may walk through this life with a limp because we all struggle with something, but there is also a God who has come to make a way for us to belong to him. Have you surrendered to him? Because when we surrender to God, in a way it's losing, but in reality it's winning. It is winning everything that can only be found in him. Would you bow your heads together with me? And just before I pray, have you taken that step of faith and trust? Maybe you've known about God, but God was more part of coming into your life and helping you realize the things that you wanted and that you saw, instead of being just somebody that we got to grab onto and hold on to and allow his blessing to come as he deems right. Maybe we've been in the middle of a struggle, and could it be that right now you thought God's a million miles away, but he's right there with you, longing to lead you in a way through this. And maybe there's a way in which God is just leading you to the defining moment of your life where you understand your purpose and your meaning, the reason that you are here. And it's not maybe what you've thought for a long, long time, but it is the purpose and the plan that God has for you. And it's a journey that you get to take with him. And you're going to decide to hold on. And Lord Jesus, thank you for this day that we can gather together and understand how it is that people like us can belong to a God like you. God, thank you for grace upon grace that has brought us this far. And God, we thank you for so much patience on your part and your willingness even to come in weakness that you chose so that we could belong to you. And it is your doing from beginning to end. And so God, help us to honor you and to seek you and to draw close to you. And God, in good times and bad and everything in between, help us to hold on to you and not let go and wait for your blessing. And lead us in that direction, God, we ask for your name's sake. So we pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen.